Maya will allow me to translate, rotate, or scale any object that I create. And in this case, I am interested in the rotation. So by default, the rotation of any object is based on its position, the position of the pivot point, which by default is in the center of the object. The nice thing about Maya is that I can move the pivot. So in this case, I'm going to hit either the insert key or the D key, and I'm going to move my pivot point down to the lower right-hand corner. And now my pivot point is there, so it will rotate or rock on the corner. At the same time, I can move this pivot point to the other side, and then I can, rock on that other side as well. So the question is, how can I set this up so that I can rotate on either of those pivots during an animation? In other words, I want this thing to rock on one side and then rock on the other side. So the way that we do that is by setting up groups. I have the outliner open. I'm going to open up the hypergraph window as well. I don't care where the pivot point is right here now because I'm going to change it a little bit later. But what I'm going to do is group this to itself. So if I go to the Edit menu and I go to Group, the group options allow me to set my pivot either at the center of this object or at the origin. So again, neither of those options is what I want. So I don't have to worry about that because I'm going to set these pivot points manually afterwards. So I'm just going to hit Control G once and then once more, and I have two nodes, and you can see if I expand them in the outliner, I get the same configuration as I have in the hypergraph. So this top node here, it has the pivot point in the center, and that's going to move the position of the cube. And that's, I can just leave that alone. So I'm just going to rename this main cube. Right? I'm going to open that up again. The one on immediately below it, I'm going to put the pivot point. It doesn't really matter. I can put it on either side. I'm going to put this one over on the lower left side. And if I were being more careful, I would snap it. But this one I'm going to call rock left. And then this one here, I'm going to move the pivot point to the right side, and I'm going to call this one rock right. So if I want to rotate this on this right corner, that's the way I would do it. And then if I want to rock it on the other corner, I would do it that way. Now the problem is that each one of these nodes is subordinate to the one above it. So if I move the main cube and I put it up here, for example, the rock left stays, the pivot point stays in the right place, and I can rotate that with no problem. And the same with the rock right. It's no problem. However, let's just put this back to 0. If I move my rock right and I don't reset that to 0, the pivot point of the rock left stays where it was, not because it doesn't move along with this because the rock right is subordinate to that node. So I'm going to end up building up this kind of system of offsets that I just don't want. So the function of this becomes a little bit more complex because when I rock this on the right and then I want to go back to rock it on the left, I have to reset this back to 0 before I can rock it on the left. And that becomes a little bit tedious. So the answer is to use a function in Maya called the set-driven key. And what set-driven key does is it creates a system, a dependency system, where you have a driver and a driven, or you have a controlling object and then you have the object that it controls. We're able to set up a driver that will drive both of these objects simultaneously. The first thing that I need is something that I can use as a driver. So in this case, I'm going to just use this main cube, but none of these attributes here is adequate for the job, because if I change any of these numbers, it's going to change the position or the what this thing looks like. So what I need is an empty slot here that just has numbers in it, that doesn't relate to anything on this cube, that I can then manually map to the attributes that I want. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go to the edit menu of the main cube here, and I have a menu item called add attribute. So I'm going to name this rock and roll, and I'm going to set my minimum value to -10, my maximum value to 10, and my default value is 0. This doesn't really matter. You can put whatever numbers in here you want. All that does is it establishes the range of the numbers that are going to appear in this slot. You can name it whatever you want. It's important that you make it a float data type, because that's a decimal, and the decimal of your attribute is going to map directly to the decimal of the rotation of each of these nodes. So I'll go ahead and say OK, and that gives me this rock and roll. The default value is 0. If I middle click and drag to the left, it goes down to -10, and if I drag to the right, it goes up to +10. It doesn't do anything other than change those numbers. So it's up to me now to set this up. So in my animation tool set, under the key menu, there's an item called set driven key, and I'm going to come over here to set, and I'm going to open up the options. So we don't have to worry about what's here. I'm going to change that. The top is the driver. The top is the controlling object. So I have the main cube here, and I'm going to load that as the driver, and then it asks me what attribute is going to be the driver. So I'm going to click the rock and roll. So now I know that this is going to be my controlling object. In this case, I want it to control both the rock left and the rock right. So I'm going to load those as the driven, and I can select both of these, and I'm going to select the rotation in Z as the controlling object, as the controlled attribute. So really, this becomes a game of Simon Says. So the main cube is Simon. When the rock and roll attribute is set to 0, I want the rotate Z attribute of both of these nodes to be 0. So I'll key that. Now those are controlled, but they're controlled by this. They're not controlled by the timeline. They're controlled by the rock and roll attribute. Next, I'm going to take the rock and roll attribute of my cube, and I'm going to set that to 10, +10. I'm going to select my rock right and rotate the Z to maybe here. Then I'm going to select both of these nodes, the rock left and the rock right, and I'm going to key that. So now when I pick this main cube and I go from 0 to 10, it rocks to the right. If I go all the way to -10, nothing happens because I haven't set that yet. So let's set it now. I move the rock and roll attribute to -10. I'm going to pick, this time, the rock left, and I'll rotate that, and then select both of these nodes and set the key. Now it's important that you pick both of these nodes and set the keys on them, because you don't want to leave either one of these behind. That's going to create the offset. So you need to make sure that that this main cube rock and roll attribute controls every aspect of both of these nodes. So let's look at this rock and roll now. And when I go from -10 to 0, it resets to 0, and then I go 10 and it rotates on the other axis. So by grouping these and using set driven key, you can control multiple attributes with one slider. And when it comes to doing an animation, the only thing that you have to keyframe now is the rock and roll attribute. So here at keyframe 1, I'm going to select this, right click, I'll say key selected, and then I'll advance to say frame 30. I'll move this to 10 and I'll key that. I'll move to 60, move this to -10 and key that, and then I'll move this up to 90 and I'll set this to 0 and I'll key that. So I'm only keying this rock and roll attribute, so as I move through the timeline, it rotates this way, rotates this way, rotates back to 0.